sandwiched between two famous kings, his father John and his son Edward. He is the forgotten ruler of the 13th century. His reign was long and not beaten until George III. So, follow me as we explore the tumultuous reign of Henry III. Let's get stuck in. The start of 1237 was spent at Winchester, where, for the first time in his life, Henry spent the Christmas with his wife Eleanor of Provence. Though, at this point, there were no children, that wouldn't happen for a couple of years yet. But it's a start. As for current affairs, already the year isn't starting off great. The previous 3 years had seen heavy rains falling all over the kingdom, causing famine, and this was followed by a drought. Add to this, the king was once again in financial difficulties, and aid was requested to get the kingdom back on its feet. But there is the usual grumbling and pushback. The barons had already paid a hefty amount of tax during the dowry of Isabella to marry Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, plus Henry's royal wedding, not to mention the gifts the king brought for young Eleanor, as well as other royal expenses. The list goes on. The barons are not happy, but still, negotiations are not as bad as in previous years. Things got sorted, all was well. Aside from the Savoyard business, but that's an ongoing gripe. Henry did request a papal legate, after years of not requiring one. And guess who turned up? Otho, the legate who tried the shenanigans with the crusade tithe. So Otho's controversial with the clergy, but he's got other powers. The powers to dissolve Henry of any oaths he signed, which reined him in. The argument being his coronation oath nullified any attempts to further limit his power. Oaths like the ones he signed away to Hubert de Burgh that time. Not the Magna Carta. But if anyone had any fears that Henry was becoming tyrannical like his father, it was things like this that worried them. Because so far, the barons, clergy, were bickering, and all this infighting was destabilising the kingdom. Like there's a tournament in Blythe that got out of control and violent. It's ridiculous. And whenever the king stepped in, they all hid behind Magna Carta. All that could be taken away. In February, Henry would receive some bad news. Joan, Lady of Wales, his sister, had passed away. The cause of death is unknown. Now, Joan was married to Llewellyn the Great, the Prince of Wales, and to make things worse, the prince suffers a heavy stroke. He lives, but his health is greatly reduced. So now, the problem in Wales lies in succession, as Llewellyn's eldest son, Adafydd, is the logical heir to inherit the kingdom. Now, Adafydd isn't the eldest son. That honour belongs to Griffith. But Griffith has been deemed illegitimate by his father, so cannot inherit. Naturally, it is Adafydd who will get the crown. Oh, and on a side note, he's married to Isabel de Bros, the great-granddaughter of the famous William de Bros, the butcher of Abergavenny, and the possible killer of Arthur of Brittany. There you go. Unfortunately, Griffith has other ideas. He wants to be heir. He wants to rule. It is clear that Wales could erupt in civil war if Llywelyn died, with both the brothers gaining support on either side. So Llywelyn requests a treaty with King Henry, a bid to legitimise Ydafydd as the rightful heir. But now another problem arises, because Henry's best magnates are away dealing with Emperor Frederick, as there's a situation going on in the Empire. Richard of Cornwall, William of Savoy and Simon de Montfort are all over there in these talks and won't be back for some time. A council with the King of Scotland also had to be postponed. Why? Because Emperor Frederick is currently at war with all the Italian city-states. He's given his nemesis, Pope Gregory, a right headache. So Frederick decides to summon all the monarchs of Christendom to a neutral ground between France and the Empire, in Vaucouleurs. Now, Henry wasn't going, but he did send his brother Richard of Cornwall. Simon de Montfort was also there with William of Savoy. Peter de Roche was supposed to go, but not only was he getting a bit too old for all this, he knew his reputation in the Empire had been ruined in previous years due to his argument with Henry. In June, the Earl of Chester, John the Scot, had also died. He was only 30 and had no male heirs. Thus, the second creation of the Earldom of Chester ended. John may have been poisoned by his wife Helen, if Matthew Paris is anything to go by. And she's the daughter of Llywelyn the Great, who we spoke about earlier. Whatever the case, Henry makes sure she's quickly married off to Robert de Quincy, a respectable knight. Three months later, in September, Henry headed up north to York with the Legate Otho, treating with Alexander of Scotland. Basically, the Scots wanted 24 square miles of land for the marriage portion of Joan, the new Queen of Scotland, Henry's other sister. On top of this, Alexander was having his own issues with creating an heir for the Scottish throne. He and his wife were already growing apart by now, and the two kings agree that Joan could travel back with Henry to England to rest at Canterbury. As for the Legate Otho, he's in London in November at a synod. One of his gripes is priests with concubines, which seems to be quite rife among the clergy, as Simon Langton brought this problem up many years ago, decades ago. So Otho gives the clergy the opportunity to rid themselves of this sin, or get suspended from the church. He wasn't mucking about. That was one thing, but when the legate threatened to end benefices, like church favours for money and all that kind of malarkey, it all kicked off. Henry had to attach armed guards to accompany Otho, in case things got out of hand. The biggest argument was with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Rich. He was sick of this archdeacon, because that's what the papal legate was, he was just an archdeacon, throwing his weight around. So Edmund Rich suggests that the Pope has to hear of this. Let him decide. So off he rides to Rome for Christmas. Not that Henry was complaining. He wasn't a great fan of the grumpy old grouch. So while the Archbishop made his hard trek to Italy, Henry was enjoying his absence in Westminster. This would be the first time Henry had a proper family do in a long time, as two of his sisters were there, and the first time they had gathered in around 15 years. Because Queen Joan of Scotland was also there, spending time with her family in London. Her sister Eleanor was the other. She's the widow of the second William Marshal, not the famous William Marshal, the Marshal's son, William Marshal, who passed away not too long ago. Now we can only imagine what was shared between the two, and of course, Queen Eleanor would also be there, no doubt learning from these two older women. Another tragic figure, another Eleanor, was also present. Eleanor, the Fair Maid of Brittany. For the last 30 or so years, she's been under house arrest in Corfe Castle. She's even spent some time in Bristol Castle. Her crime? Being related to Arthur of Brittany, which may give her a possible claim to the territory of Brittany. A territory which belongs to John the Red. And here she was, with the other three women. She'd spent the whole Christmas period here. This Christmas, Henry was content. He had it all. His sisters, his wife, the grumblers dealt with, along with that curmudgeonly Archbishop. Though I will mention, this is not how Richard of Cornwall saw it. He thought the king was descending into madness. Another problem will arise, as it's not just Cornwall who's back from the Empire, it's Savoy and Simon de Montfort. Oh, Simon de Montfort. He's about to do something rather rash. He's about to fall in love. You see, Eleanor, the widow, Henry's sister, was once married to the younger William Marshal, not the famous knight, his son. But the son had died several years back. Since then, Eleanor had taken a vow of chastity, following the death of her husband. Most likely bullied into the decision by the Marshal family. The apples had fallen far from the tree. But Simon had the looks, the charm. He's got a PhD in charisma. Swept her right off her feet. It is unknown exactly when they met, but it is clear that the two lovebirds had met prior to this. After all, Simon had been in the kingdom for around 7 years by this point, and she, Eleanor, had been married to one of the most prestigious magnates in the kingdom. They must have met before. And around these Christmas celebrations, they were engaged to be married early the next year. Her brother Henry didn't really have much of a problem with it, if it wasn't for the vow of chastity, but that can be overwritten. After all, he and de Montfort are best friends. Simon is the royal favourite. It's the Archbishop of Canterbury, though. He would have a gripe. A vow is a vow. Plus, she's breaking that vow to a foreigner. He was very much against it. Simon and Eleanor must have been planning this wedding for some time, as no sooner had the Archbishop left the kingdom around Christmas on his mission to complain to the Pope about that papal legate, the wedding was on. When New Year came, and 1238 was upon the kingdom, Eleanor married de Montfort about a week after the New Year. Yet this was a very controversial wedding. It meant that the whole affair was done in secret. King Henry summoned the two to his solar, his private quarters. The only other person there was a priest named Walter. He's in charge of the King's private chapel at Westminster Palace in London. These four were the only people present at the wedding. Of course, word eventually gets out, and the king's brother, Richard of Cornwall, is livid. He actually raises an army in anger. Richard is joined by Eleanor's brother-in-law, Gilbert Marshal. There were also allegations that the Marshal's family had been bullying her for years. This new run of Marshals were not a nice bunch, and should Eleanor marry a powerful man like de Montfort, the lid could blow off. Thankfully for Henry, this wasn't a civil war, just anger venting, whipped up by Richard of Cornwall, the gripe being that Henry was favouring foreigners again, ignoring the English. And the Londoners were also whipped up into a frenzy, and soon Henry had holed himself up in the Tower of London, expecting things to kick off at any minute. Councillor John Fitzgeoffrey was sent to negotiate, but it was a tough job. Richard and his grumblers were pointing out that Magna Carta clearly was not strict enough. Clearly, more reforms are needed. They are proposing that 4 discreet barons would be needed to deal with the King's Council. These 4 barons are called the Conservators of Liberties. These 4 conservators would include a justiciar and a chancellor, the 2 positions the king got rid of a few years ago, and this quango would have full knowledge of government workings. More, they'd have the power to remove anyone deemed to have a bad influence on the king, and only they can appoint and remove members. For the 13th century, this was radical reform. It was pretty much asking for a constitutional monarchy, making Parliament a state institution that would run the kingdom. This was part of an ongoing period that will haunt the king for some time, as these particular reforms would come to a head in around 1244 of the paper constitution, most likely similar to the evolution of the Magna Carta, arguments being drawn up and rewritten over the best part of a decade, culminating in the deals we are more familiar with. And spoiler alert, this won't be the end of the reforms. There'll be a lot more to come. Henry is not happy with it. Like King John, referring to the Magna Carta, Henry would have the same reaction to the Conservators of Liberties. Do you also want my kingdom? There was no way Henry would agree to all of this. He'd never be a figurehead. Right, the papal legate and Peter de Roche had to meet with the king, reminding him just how serious this issue was, and on the 2nd of February there was a conference meeting. Talks dragged on until late February. Henry needed a way out of this. He had a plan. Once again, Henry took a leaf out of the book of his cousin, Blanche of Castile. Why fight? Why negotiate when you can simply bribe the ringleader? And once again, Richard of Cornwall is happily bribed with £4,000 and other lavish gifts. Henry knew his brother well. Suddenly, Richard of Cornwall's support for the rebel cause evaporates, and he makes peace with both his brother and de Montfort. One happy family. Meanwhile, actual supporters of the reforms were more angry than ever, and the Archbishop of Canterbury would give his support. This wasn't a matter that would simply go away, and it did not need Richard of Cornwall. But that's being cynical, as there was no doubt another, more deeper reason for the 2 brothers to put their differences aside, rather than just money and greed. Remember Joan from earlier? Henry's sister, Queen of Scotland. She's been staying in Canterbury following Henry's visit to York to treat with her husband, the Scottish King Alexander. When they headed back down south, Joan went with her brother, because the marriage really wasn't going well, and the couple were estranged. She was at the Christmas court, as I mentioned earlier, and around this time, her health took a dark turn. In late February, Knowing she had not long to live, she wrote her will. On the 4th of March, 1238, she passed away in her brother's arms. She was only 27. Distraught, Henry made a marble tomb, and Joan was interred at a nunnery in Dorset, at Tarrant. But why Dorset? She was the Queen of Scotland. Well, her husband, he'd washed his hands of her. He made no effort to get her body back, nor put any money in for the funeral. It was all up to Henry. This location in Dorset was probably chosen as Queen Eleanor, Henry's wife, had received the chapel as a part of a patronage, and as the two women most certainly got along, it made sense. Now the royal entourage made their sombre journey from London to Dorset for the funeral, and Henry paid £21, a huge amount in this day and age, for lavish silks to cover the altars of every chapel they stopped at. 26 chapels in all. Henry would mourn her for the rest of his life. In the background, while all this was going on, was the papal legate Otho. He's busy solidifying his position within the kingdom. After gaining the king's seal of approval, he quickly gained support from Richard of Cornwall and several key bishops, all who want Otho to remain in the kingdom, despite what Archbishop Edmund Rich thinks. Soon after the funeral, Henry is at Abingdon, Oxfordshire. There, Legate Otho gives him a surprise visit. As Otho was only in nearby Oxford, chances are that, not far from Oxford University. But Otho has come with some bad news. Right, here is his tale. Some students at the university hear that the legate is at a nearby abbey, where he is staying with the canons. No, not artillery pieces, but religious canons. And they decide they want to pay their respects to him. Then some trouble starts when they are turned away by the Italian porter who was there. So the students turn up with a larger number and force their way into the abbey. And do remember that this is the Middle Ages, so students here are clergy. They're not part of regular society, which makes this much worse, as they are acting like barbarians. Among this mob was an Irish chaplain who'd fallen on hard times. Hungry, he finds his way into the kitchen, where he demands food from the cook, only for the cook to get angry and pour hot soup all over him. Things escalate quickly when one of the students shoots the cook with a crossbow. Yes, they brought a crossbow. All hell breaks loose, and Otho ends up hiding in the bell tower. The chaos was still ongoing when Otho manages to escape on horseback. His servants remained back at the abbey, but he gets to the king nearby. That's why he's here. And the king decides to help the legate and sends Otho back to Oxford with an armed guard. Ending the chaos. Thus, Oxford University was put under a religious interdict, meaning no mass, no rites, etc. The university is effectively under excommunication, and all lectures are put on hold. It's always a small few who spoil it for everybody. In April, Henry's mind was most likely on politics regarding the Holy Roman Empire, as Emperor Frederick's conflict with the northern Italian states was still ongoing. The empire was wiping the floor with them utterly annihilating the Lombard League at the Battle of Cortenuova. But unfortunately, the League were still clinging to the fight and refusing to quit. Thing is, there's a crusade upcoming, and the Emperor pretty much wanted to have all his affairs done and dusted before he embarked on it. Richard of Cornwall was already signed up, so Frederick is trying to influence Richard of Cornwall to commit troops to the effort in Italy, before they both head off to the crusade. What's more, Savoy is a part of the Holy Roman Empire, so William of Savoy heads off also with a retinue of troops to aid Frederick. So far, so good. Right, an ally of Frederick is the Byzantine Emperor Baldwin II, and Baldwin arrives in England that April, asking Henry for support. So the English king ends up sending Frederick a contingent of soldiers. This contingent would aid the siege efforts. Continuing with foreign affairs, I'll also mention news that a coterie of Saracens, of all people, have arrived in England. They've just travelled all the way from the Middle East to meet with King Louis in France, and now they come to Henry bearing terrible news. They tell of a new enemy in the east, a fierce race of barbarians that are flooding across the lands, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake, the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. The so-called Devil's Horsemen were crashing through every army they encountered, a problem of biblical proportions. The Mongols were proving quite the pest. By 1238, Genghis Khan himself had been dead for some time, but his legend was living on in the form of the next great Khan, his son Ogedai. He's just as brutal as his father. Ogedai had invaded lands in far-off China. The Jin dynasty had already fallen. Now the Mongols had turned against their former allies, the Song, a war which was still ongoing. They're unstoppable. Now, a branch called the Golden Horde is led by Batu Khan, and he's pushing his horsemen into Russia, burning towns and villages in his wake. The city of Vladimir had fallen early this year. The Mongols were slamming their forces into Eastern Europe. Even England is affected, as in Great Yarmouth, their two largest exports of fish is Russia and the Baltic, and they are not making the usual orders due to all this havoc. The Saracens, who have arrived as envoys, also explained to Henry that the Mongols have invaded Persia. Even the Islamic world is under threat. They are seeking aid to fight this apocalyptic threat. Henry asks advice from Peter de Roche on how to deal with this threat. What should he tell the Saracen envoy? Of all the people to ask, so what does the Bishop of Winchester suggest? Tell the Saracens to rot. Peter couldn't care less if the Mongols wiped them out. In fact, he'd appreciate it. Let the dogs eat one another, and then the Pope could take the Holy Land with ease. But this wasn't professional advice. De Roche isn't on any council. Peter is no longer the man we've seen over the course of this series, and going back to King John, that ambitious scallywag with his baldy tails who used to mentor the young king. No, In 1238, he's a washed-up old man grumbling to an old friend. He's an aged bishop who's seen far too much war. He's been on crusade and then bitter by it. He was there at the Battle of Lincoln with William Marshall. In June, the old bishop said his last rites, confessed his many sins, and passed from this earth. As far as Henry was concerned, he'd known the old man since he was a child. Peter de Roche was never a foreigner in his eyes. He'd lost a friend and a mentor. De Roche's death was considered an irreparable loss. He was entombed at Winchester Cathedral and still rests there to this day, almost forgotten and hidden away, overshadowed by more famous names like Emma of Normandy and Jane Austen. A problem arises almost immediately, as guess who Henry wants as the new Bishop of Winchester? William of Savoy. This was squashed, which only frustrates Henry. Once again, he's not getting his way, and if anything, he's annoying the clergy in Winchester. Even the Pope didn't want to get involved in all of the squabbling that's going on in the English Church. Oh, and Edmund Rich, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is currently still in Rome, so the Pope invites him to a lavish banquet. Oddly, Edmund turns this down. He's looking to return back to England. Lucky he did, as there's an assassin among the guests. And the nephew of one of the cardinals is slain in front of all. This would not be the last assassin of the year. On the 9th of September, King Henry was conducting a council in Woodstock. No, not the hippie festival, the English town of Woodstock. Everything is going well for once. That was until one of his clerks went off the rails, so to speak. This clerk kept on insisting that he, not Henry, was the real King of England. He was ranting and raving like a lunatic. Eventually, some of the guests had heard enough and gave the man a bit of a beating, but Henry intervened and ordered this clerk to be just ejected from the building. And so he was. But once again, the king proves a useless judge of character, as this was no clerk, but a hired assassin, sent by the notorious pirate William Morisco, who's currently hiding away on Lundy Island. Morisco is the man who killed a clerk only a year ago, before fleeing and escaping punishment. And Morisco is bent on revenge, hence the assassin. And all the dastardly killer needed was a ruse to scope the building. That night, he put his plan into action. His plan to assassinate the King of England. Armed with a knife, the assassin scaled the wall and entered the king's bedchamber through a window. He headed to the bed, but then his heart sank. The bed was empty, as the king was elsewhere, in his wife's bedroom. But the assassin had alerted the chambermaids, who raised the alarm. There was no way out. Even locking the door didn't work as it was busted through, and the would-be killer was caught. He was tried and sentenced for treason. His punishment? To be dragged, drawn, and quartered. He's possibly the first to suffer this type of terrible execution in English history, which would later be called hung or hanged, drawn, and quartered. I'll let Matthew Paris fill you in on the details. At first he was dragged asunder. He was then beheaded. Finally, his body was divided into 3 parts, each piece being taken to 3 major cities and displayed in a gibbet. Yeah, definitely not a slap on the wrist. Henry, meanwhile, installs bars on his windows, should this happen again. He even has a grille on his garderobe at the castle toilet, should the threat come from below. The king is spooked by this, paranoid. And this Christmas Henry would spend it in Winchester, though without his old friend and mentor, Peter de Roche. The king did manage, though, to offend Gilbert Marshall, possibly accusing the Earl of having part in the assassination attempt. There was also tension between Gilbert and Simon de Montfort over Eleanor. There's also tension with the bishops there. Henry was hoping that next year would be better.